I'm a little bit selfish, egoistic, self-involved, self-absorbed, self-regarding. Now, I'm not being self-loathing. I think all of humanity has an inclination towards selfishness. I'm not picking on myself. I think every single person has some version of being self-centered. I think selfishness is an existential fact. And I think today, our Bible passage, John 8, is in essence about self-centeredness. Now, this might surprise you. It doesn't look like selfishness plays any manifest role in this passage, but I think it's in there, and I'll discuss that in a little bit. But first, I just want to celebrate this awesome Bible passage. It's in my top 3. Do you have a top 3? I always try to have my top 3 gospel moments in my mind. Now, they change all the time, but I think it's great to have a top 3 at any moment that you can keep to mind so they can help guide your living. My top 3 right at the moment, well, one is Luke 15. Luke 15, the parable of the prodigal son. Remember, the son goes off and lives in dissolution and kind of craziness, comes back thinking he's going to have to beg his father for forgiveness. But the father runs out and just showers immediate grace and forgiveness upon him. This is our great parable about our God. And I think we all could do well to keep this to mind, that our God is so fast and overflowing, prodigal really, in offering forgiveness. You're holding something against yourself. I know there's things I still can't let go, mistakes or ways I went sideways. But you need to remember, God has forgiven you yesterday what you're trying to hold on to today. God's forgiveness is always a step ahead of our own resentment. Did you hear that? God's forgiveness is always a step ahead of our self-resentment. So whatever you're holding on to right now, let go of it, because God has. God has forgiven you. I try to keep Luke 15 to mind. I'm also keeping Mark 9 as one of my top 3 right now. In Mark 9, Jesus and the disciples are walking to Capernaum, and when they get to the house, Jesus says, "What were you guys talking about on the road?" Jesus knows. The disciples, as the narrator tells us, were arguing about who was the greatest among them. And they're embarrassed to even answer Jesus. So when you get 12 dudes together, somebody's going to go for alpha male. So the fact they were arguing about who's the greatest, it's not a surprise. But I try to keep this passage to mind because we are constantly comparing ourselves against one another. Who's a little better? Who's a little ahead? These constant comparisons will make your life miserable. I try to keep Mark 9 to mind. It's not our job to compare ourselves to anyone, but to be our best self, to be who we are. Social media has made a phrase sound really dumb, that you do you, but I think it has a gospel truth to it. You do you. You don't need to compare yourself to anyone else. And what we consider a great life, we have these versions of what greatness would be, success and being competitive. At that moment, Jesus draws a child into his arms and tells the disciples, those who are last will be first. Become like a child. I keep Mark 9 to my mind these days. Any moment I'm trying to compare myself to someone else or being overly competitive. But then John 8 is in my top 3 right now because it's a beautiful passage. The Pharisees have dragged this woman in front of Jesus. There's this scary, really hideous moment of potential male patriarchal violence against a woman. They've dragged this woman in front of Jesus in an attempt to delegitimize Jesus, to trap him in not following the law, and says that she has been caught in adultery and that the law says they should stone her. There's this hideous moment where violence could erupt, and then Jesus, in his simple gentleness and peace, he perfectly defuses the situation, decompresses it, just kneels down to the ground as a sort of diversion, I think, a gentle diversion, begins to doodle in the sand, lets it decompress a little, and then he says to those men, "Let the first among you who is without sin throw the stone." Somehow Jesus has brought his gentleness and peace into a situation that was almost sure to erupt in violence. The Pharisees drop their stones and move on. It is a beautiful passage. I think the woman in this passage is almost exactly like Hester Prynne. Do you remember Hester Prynne in Nathaniel Hawthorne's masterwork, The Scarlet Letter? Now, I've never heard anyone say that Hawthorne had John 8 in his mind to create his novel, but this story, John 8, is so deeply embedded in the Western psyche. I think clearly it is sort of a template. This woman is exactly like Hester Prynne. Do you remember that she's a member of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, surrounded by religious fundamentalists and Puritans, and that her husband has been lost at sea. She's alone. She thinks he's dead, and she starts to have a relationship with someone. But in the Puritan fundamentalism of the time, they find out, and she's become pregnant, and they make her wear a scarlet letter. You remember the story from high school, right? And they bring her out onto the scaffold and make her stand in front of everyone's contempt and judging. It's exactly like the scene in John 8. And when you're reading the Scarlet Letter, you think Hester Prynne is a victim. But then as the story goes on, you begin to realize she's not a victim. She's a heroine. She becomes one of the most important female protagonists in American literature. She's fierce. She's the hero. In John 8, you might think this woman also is the victim. It reads that way at first. But as you let this passage begin to soak into your mind, you realize this woman in John 8 isn't a victim. She too is fierce and a heroine. You remember in the story about Hester Prynne that over time you learn that she is able to weather what shame they're trying to put on her. A lot of literary scholars think that this novel is about the sort of male anxiety in a patriarchy about controlling female sexuality. But in this story, Hester Prynne just keeps composed and strong and raises her child Pearl. Even when they try to take her away, she fights that off, and over time she builds this embroidery kind of business, and women around Boston begin to see in her a quiet confidant, a hero. Well, in this passage in John 8, this unnamed woman, so much like Hester Prynne, starts to show how fierce and strong she is. In all the other scenes in the gospel, people scream out to help for Jesus, for healing, to be healed, to be helped. All through the gospel, people are asking for help. Do you notice in this passage, this woman doesn't ask for help at all. She stands there among those men. And then it depends how you read the one line. When Jesus asks her, "Has anyone condemned you?" she responds, "No one, sir." It depends how you hear that read. You might hear it meekly, her saying, "No one, sir." Or you might realize that she's actually fierce and she's saying, "No one." She's the last one standing in this passage. Even Jesus kneeled and all the men slinked off. They scurried off like cockroaches when you turn a light on. Jesus and this woman, they turn a light on. She's the last one standing. She's Hester Prynne fierce. I love this passage. Now, do you know Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote the Scarlet Letter in 1850, right when some of the best feminist thought was emerging in America. In 1848 was the Seneca Falls Convention with people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others that began to declare equality among the sexes, some of the first clearest declarations in American history for that. That's 1848. Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote in 1850, and this is about the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was our denomination. The Puritans are Congregationalists. And do you know, right in the midst of this, Seneca Falls Convention, Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, then in 1853, we became the first denomination in the world to ordain a woman to ministry. It's as if this conversation was just emerging full force and we finally heard the truth. But 1853, isn't that amazing? The first denomination to ordain a woman. Okay, I said at the beginning, I would claim this passage is about being self-centered at its essence. Now let me get to that. You see, the key line is, let those among you who are without sin be the first to throw the stone. Sin. Sin is right at the center of this passage. But sin is now a hard word for us to understand. We have done such harm theologically to our understanding of sin. We have called things sin that aren't sin. Like once you call playing cards or dancing or being gay a sin, you've lost your legitimacy. We've called certain things sin instead of understanding it to be an existential reality of how we are imperfect and in fact deeply wounded. Sin, when you see this word, let me offer a tip. We've so ruined this word. Let me offer a way to redeem it. Every time you see the word sin in the Bible or you hear religion talk about it, transpose the word from sin to self-centered. I think this is the basic reality when Christians use the word sin that we're talking about, a selfishness. Just transpose the word. Every time you see it, think selfishness or self-centeredness. You see, this is how it works, how sin works or self-centeredness works. We become, in some basic way, we are self-centered in some basic way. And that means we'll begin to view other persons as objects, not really as persons. They're objects in our enterprise because we're a little self-involved, we're a little selfish, we have sin, selfishness. We begin to use other people for our own projects. And once you have a basic selfishness or sin, and once people are objects, you can economically exploit them, you can perpetrate violence against them. You see, when you the word sin, transpose it to self-centeredness. Because religion has ruined the word and we try to create all this guilt and we talk about how you're sinful. This line in the Bible in John 8, let those among you who are without sin be the first to throw a stone. That's the classic line to say that sin is universal. That it's assuming that we know that everyone is sinful. But we've heard that in such guilt-producing ways. But hear it as an existential fact. We all do have a measure of being selfish. And that can begin a sequence that creates so much harm and nefarious consequences. So the church is being honest when it talks about sin, selfishness. It's being true and honest, and it's reminding each one of us, you're holding a stone. You are holding the stone of selfishness. And the gospel wants you to drop that. You see, all of religion is poised to try to move you from self-centeredness to other-centeredness, to reality-centeredness. All of religion is poised to try to draw you out of that basic selfishness or sin that we can reside in. We're all holding that stone of self-centeredness, and the gospel wants you to drop it. All of religion becomes this amazing strategy to help you get beyond a self-centeredness. Our gospel performs a jujitsu, really. It says, love your neighbor as yourself. It assumes you love yourself, and we should, but it tries to use, this is jujitsu, it tries to use that selfishness or self-regard as a way to create an embrace of others. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. We're all holding the stone of self-centeredness. Let go of that. See others not as objects, but as persons. The beauty of the gospel. Amen.